comrades. My name is Akila Nai. I'm the Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, and I am joined by Chairman Omali Yeshitela on this special Omali Taught Me broadcast to deal with the situation in Bolivia. Chairman is going to help us understand the events unfolding as it relates to this deepening crisis of imperialism. We're going to get some historical context and intend to leave this discussion today having a better sense for what this means for the African liberation movement. So without further ado, Chairman, can you tell us about Bolivia?
Uhuru. First of all, I want to thank you, Comrade Director Akile Anai. This is a discussion that is roiling much of the world today, much of the various forms of media, the issue of Bolivia. And what is clear to many people, and perhaps most people of the world, is that the crisis in Bolivia, the contradiction in Bolivia, is a coup that was initiated with the firm support of the United States, and one might even assume the leadership of the United States, because in addition to what we see coming from the United States, we see the Organization of American States that played a role in this process, and also it is claimed that NATO may have had some kind of involvement as well. In addition to that, we see most of the ruling media of the world, and certainly inside the United States, uniting with the objectives of the coup and acting as a political and ideological cover for the fact that Evo Morales, who was elected president of Bolivia, an 11 million people strong country, and the first indigenous president in that country's history, despite the fact that Bolivia is a majority indigenous country, and had been in power nearly 14 years as a consequence of being popularly elected. And in the last election, October 20th, I think it was, won the election by a huge margin. And that's despite all of the efforts that have been made by this ruling white nationalist oligarchy that has been ensconced in power in Bolivia for the last 100 or more years. And of course, that does not make Bolivia unusual. The reality is that while most people do not talk about the situation in South America in these terms, the majority of the indigenous people who live in South America live as suffering peasants. And of course, the vast majority of Africans who live there live under the worst kinds of desperate poverty. And what we have come to know as revolutions in the Americas has essentially been revolutions that have been led by Spaniards or other Europeans against Spain and other European powers. In the same way, in this country, the United States, we had what was called a revolution when white people in this country rose up against England and fought for control of indigenous land and the wealth that was created off that land by enslaved African people. So Bolivia was like that too. And the distinction in Bolivia, say, and the United States, is the fact that the majority of the people in Bolivia are indigenous people. And so I think it's really important to make that statement. So clearly, we stand in solidarity with the people of Bolivia. We stand in solidarity with Comrade Evo Morales and the organization that they have created. And being opposed to what the United States has done, continues to do, etc. But I wanted to say that we have to say more than that. There are things that we have to learn from this that's really important for us. And part of what we need to understand is that the way this discussion is happening around Bolivia is a reflection of the defeat of the revolution of the 1960s, in part because when you look at Bolivia and South America, you're looking at the inability of the Cuban Revolution as it expressed itself during that time to really facilitate revolutionary transformation all over South America. And you are looking at the fact that the Black Revolution of the 1960s was defeated, crushed, and what we understood about revolution at that time is not something that is even talked about or thought about today. And so we live in a world that's swimming in opportunism, where people who claim to be leftist, revolutionary, socialists, and what have you can do that without any kind of argument. All they have to do is claim that they are socialists, claim that they are leftist or revolutionary, and that's enough. So there's no real definition of what it is to be a socialist. I mean, Bernie Sanders is a socialist, and he's a socialist because he's going to make $15 an hour minimum wage a reality over a number of years. And there are other people who call themselves socialists as well, who may even be more militant and sharper than Sanders. But what is socialism? And that's something that we really need to look at. And the question is, what is revolution? And when we look at what's happening in Bolivia, it's not the first time we have seen it. We've seen it over and over again, because the fact of the matter is socialist revolution requires the ability of the working class to come to power. The working class becomes the state. Evo Morales is out of power now because the military told him that he had to quit power. And the military and the police on the ground in Bolivia have worked against him. They've terrorized people. They've burned houses of people who are his supporters, people who are in the government. They've done all these kinds of things. But the military is a form of the state. So when Morales was elected, a socialist who was elected, an indigenous person who was elected, it didn't mean anything, because the state power was still in the possession of the rulers who had possessed it all along, and that state power and that ruling class was subservient to the interests of the United States government and imperialism in general. Real socialist revolution, real socialism presupposes, again, that the working class has become the state. The armed workers have become the state. So that couldn't have been possible under those circumstances. And it's like we're going back looking at what happened in Chile in 1972 or somewhere around that time, where you had the election, a popular election of President Salvador Allende, who was this socialist who was elected to power in Chile. And revolutionary socialists from all over South America rushed into Chile with the assumption that somehow, because this guy was elected, it meant that socialism was afoot. It meant that the revolution had a headquarters in Chile. And of course, what happened was Allende's election did not confer state power onto him. The state machine was still in possession of the same ruling class and still subservient to the United States government, so that Henry Kissinger from the United States and other forces like that were able to command that military force, and they killed Allende. But they didn't just kill Allende, they rounded up revolutionaries from throughout South America who had come to Chile and put them in soccer stadiums where they executed thousands of them. That was a consequence of that unclarity on what it takes to actually have a genuine revolutionary movement and for socialism to really come into existence. That's what we see here. That socialism is not just a declaration. It's not something that you wish and for it to occur. It's not something you say, I'm a socialism and let there be socialism and it occurs. Socialism, real socialism, is the ascension of the working class to the role of the ruling class, where the working class itself, where the state becomes the armed working class. So I think it's important, because what is the state? The state is this organized force of coercion. It is the army, it's the military, it's the police, it's the court system. It's all those things that you see at play now in Bolivia that is saying that it's all right to torture, it's all right to murder, it's all right to kill all those people who had come to power or thought they had come to power with the election of Evo Morales. It's all right to kick him out of power, even though he's the president. He didn't have control of the army, the police, or anything like that, because he didn't have control of the state. Because the state was still in the possession of the ruling class, that white nationalist ruling class that's subservient to the white nationalist ruling class of the United States. So I think that's one of the things that's really important for us to say. And the reality is that a failure on the part of Morales, and a failure on the part of Allende, and a failure on the part of the organization that Morales was building for socialism is the fact that coming into power, even being elected, the first responsibility would have been to arm the workers, arm the working class.
to give the working class, to confer upon the working class the ability to defend their revolution. Because right now, as we are having this discussion, they're in the streets of La Paz and other parts of Bolivia trying to defend that revolution, despite the fact that Evo Morales has been forced to leave the country and is in Mexico. And it's clear that Morales is like clarity on what it means to ascend to power as a revolutionary socialist, because he does not clearly does not even recognize the class contradiction. He recognizes what he characterizes as these racist thugs who are responsible for leading this process. But he calls now. He was calling for his supporters to be peaceful, and that the Bolivian, we should not fight among our Bolivian brothers. Those are not your brothers. Those are the class enemies and the national oppressors of our people who are in Bolivia. And if you don't have the ability to draw the line around class, etc., then you're not talking about socialism. You're talking about, there is a popular philosophy that dominates much of the discussion, especially in the United States but other places, so that you don't have to have a revolution. You pick up popular stuff, pick up popular anti-homophobic, popular gender liberation, and popular this kind of stuff that has no relationship to a scientific assessment of what it takes to make revolution and to free all the oppressed and toiling masses, including women, including homosexuals, including the working class, and where power has to be consolidated. This is the struggle that we're involved in. And it's not something to play with, because the rulers are not playing, and we have a time in history today where the crisis of imperialism is deep and profound, and that the masses of people must have power, and they cannot have power unless there's clarity conferred on this process through revolution. That's what the African People's Socialist Party is about. We're a revolutionary organization. Our objective is to complete the Black Revolution of the 1960s. I'm looking at the New York Times today. There's almost more than a half-page article in the New York Times that expresses this real dilemma that much of the world, according to the New York Times, and much of the intellectual world is confronted with, trying to deal with this blurry line, as they characterize it, between a coup and an uprising. Because what has happened is so clearly a coup. Now, what the New York Times is the mouthpiece of international white power imperialism. Now the New York Times wants to muddy up the water and say sometimes what looks like a coup really isn't a coup, and it's a popular uprising. Like sometimes what appears to be a popular uprising is really a coup. And sometimes there's a combination of the two of them, and then they quote these people that they have created and dragged out of someplace and say that this is a problem that's been existing since the end of the Cold War. Of course, the end of the Cold War was where the contest, at least theoretically and politically, between communism and capitalism was sharpest, where during this period that they call Cold War, the struggle for socialism against capitalism was clearly sharpest. And so the New York Times even finds itself acting as a mouthpiece, as it always does, of the bourgeoisie, and trying to offer a cover for what's happening in Bolivia. So this is something that we need to understand. We have to have a revolutionary party, and the workers have to have a revolutionary party, and you have to have real cadre that recognizes its role in making and bringing the future into existence. And so that's one aspect of it. Another thing that we have to recognize is that this notion that is purely fanciful, that many people who call themselves Marxists have come forward with, that somehow that capitalism is something that sprang sort of naturally through the contradictions in European feudalism. And out of European feudalism, there emerged this higher level of economic life, a higher kind of a social existence that is capitalism. It didn't happen that way. It really didn't happen that way. In fact, there was such an artificial description that Marx himself had to explain that what happened to bring capitalism into existence, what happened that made capitalist production possible, or the capitalist accumulation necessary for capitalist production possible, was what he called a primitive accumulation. That was not the consequence of capitalist production, but a starting point. And he said the starting point of capitalist production was turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. He talked about how the so-called wage slavery in Europe required as a pedestal slavery pure and simple, and what he characterized as the New World. The New World included Peru, included all of South America. All of these are places that owe their existence to the slave trade, into the economy, the world economy that came into existence because of that. The Europeans who Morales is fighting against today in Bolivia, people who came into existence there as a part of the capitalist experience, as a part of the capitalist project. And so what you have, and that's why we talk all the time about how we talk about capital, white power, and is a capitalism that is forged and formed on the backs of slavery and colonialism. The colonization of the indigenous people, those who survived the presence of European, the enslavement of African people, a whole new economy was created. That's worldwide, etc. You don't get out of that by fighting the battle that Marx talked about. You get out of that by removing the pedestal upon which all capitalist activity exists, and that is colonialism and slavery. So the indigenous people, to have socialism, means that everybody who's interested in having socialism, you unite with the interests of the indigenous people in the Americas, and all of the Americas, including the United States, including Houston, Texas, including Jamaica, including all these places that are necessary for the existence of capitalism. And that means you unite with the demand for reparations by black people. That means that you're not trying to solve a problem for imperialism, you're trying to bring imperialism down, because it's a blood-sucking entity that cannot exist except for continuous theft of the resources and lives of the people of the world, including right there in Bolivia. So I am concerned. We have a cadre right now in Venezuela. And we're in Venezuela because there was the first international conference of so-called Afro-descendants that occurred in Venezuela. And African people are there from various parts of the world, and some from revolutionary organizations that certainly they were in terms of their history, like, excuse me, Cabral's party, you know, out of Guinea-Bissau, and there are various other forces, some of whom we know. But Comrade Luiz is really concerned. Comrade Luiz Kinshasa, who is the Secretary General of the African Socialist International. He's over the African Socialist International because we have concluded that the Black Revolution, the African Revolution, has run into its limitations when we attempt to fight for our freedom within the context of the borders that have been created for us by white power, by imperialism. Whether that's Bolivia, whether that's the United States, whether that's Europe, whether that's in any part of Africa or the Caribbean. And so Comrade Luiz is there. Participating in this Pan-Africanist conference, where he said it's more like a party than anything else, and he cannot find cadre. People who recognize a distinction between the oppressed and the oppressor. People who recognize the responsibility to have revolutionary organization. People who recognize that in order for us to be free, we have to defeat the oppressor. The truth of the matter is that capitalism and socialism cannot occupy the same space. In order for there to be socialism, and capitalism has to be defeated. In order for capitalism to be defeated, one has to have a revolutionary theory. In order for that theory to be meaningful, one has to have a revolutionary organization. In order to have a revolutionary organization, one has to have revolutionaries, and otherwise cadre, whose profession is revolution, and that's what we have to fight for right now, and that's how we have to understand Bolivia and what's happening in Bolivia, and have to be concerned about Venezuela and concerned about revolutionary projects all over the world, including Bolivia and including inside this country and all over the continent of Africa as well. So I think this is part of what we want to say. I mean, obviously we denounce what is happening, what the United States and the rest of them have done, but we can denounce. That's what we've been doing over the last period, denouncing. We must protest it if there's possible to wage protests and demonstrations against the United States, against NATO, against the Organization of American States. We should do those things as well. And if it becomes necessary to occupy another embassy, occupy the embassy, but build revolutionary organization, build cadre, have revolutionary theory, and recognize that if we are to have socialism, it's going to have to be won, it's going to have to be fought, it's not going to be handed to us. And we say, victory to the masses of Venezuela, victory to the masses of people right there in Bolivia, because the people in Bolivia, the masses of people want to fight, they want to struggle. And that's being demonstrated right now as we have this discussion. But they're not armed. The military is armed. That's the state power is armed, and it's a state power that's hostile to the interests of the people. And Bolivia had under Morales, just the development of the resources of the people there, their lifestyle has been enhanced so much over the last 14 years, not to speak of the fact that you have this majority population living under white nationalist opposition, and what that meant for their morale and the rest of that. Now that has been crushed. And what we are saying is that the people in Bolivia are not alone, and that we have a responsibility to be a revolutionary organization, and that has to be a major contribution that we make. It's not good enough to be standing on the sidelines cheering on people someplace else. Bolivia is not going to make this revolution for us, no place else. And right now, even the reactionary government of Chile has been forced to try to talk about changing its constitution because the masses are in the streets. And as I just mentioned, despite the shortcomings that we see in this meeting, this international conference in Venezuela for the so-called Afro-descendants, despite the shortcomings, it is activity, and we are there. And we are there and to intervene to the extent that we can to bring an African internationalist perspective to that, and to organize who can be organized to win our liberation, not only there, but every place in the world, and to contribute to the development of a genuine revolutionary socialist movement for the peoples and workers of the world. Uhuru.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I just want to give you a round of applause. Yes, thank you again for that amazing summation of what we're seeing in Bolivia and how that relates to everything that's happening in the world, and the charge for us as members of the African People's Socialist Party, as a revolutionary organization fighting to bring about genuine socialism, that's fighting for unity of theory and practice, not just claiming to be socialist, but fighting to overthrow capitalism, which will bring about the genuine creation of socialism.
I just want to thank everybody. I know this was something that was called on short notice. I just want to remind everybody too that the party's plenary, first plenary from our 7th Congress will be happening in from February 1st through the 3rd in St. Petersburg, Florida. And this is part of what it is we have to deal with. I mean, the theme, the slogan of our plenary is Vanguard Up. The unity of practice and theory. And because if people are tired, the people are tired, we can exhaust the masses of always having a good idea, and that's all, never doing anything. But the people become exhausted by just coming out to hear theory and not seeing any material manifestation of what it means in the world and how it's going to take us to a new day. Our party we are practical revolutionaries, and we have practical programs existing all around the world, but these practical programs are informed by revolutionary theory. And we have a revolutionary organization and several organizations that are under the leadership of this revolutionary organization that we intend to go to freedom with. I want to send a special message of solidarity again to brothers and sisters and all our comrades in South America. Special message of solidarity to especially the comrades who are working in the African Socialist International in what is commonly known as South Africa, that we refer to as Occupied Azania, to all of our forces on the continent of Africa and throughout Europe and the Americas. Victory is certain. We continue to build, and that's what we say, Vanguard Up, and we're fighting for the unity of theory and practice, practice and theory. And theory without practice is meaningless, and practice without theory is just blind. So we don't want to be blind nor meaningless. Let's move this agenda forward and again solidarity and victory to the people of Bolivia, recognizing, of course, that in Bolivia we are fighting a common enemy. We are fighting against U.S. imperialism, which is the strategic enemy of all the peoples on the planet Earth.
Vanguard up!
Vanguard up!